Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, as Syrians look for clues as to what happened to their loved ones after 5 decades of Assad rule, the White Helmets say they've called off their search operation at the notorious Sednaya prison. Syria's new leaders offer rewards as they vow to track down former Assad regime officials responsible for torture and war crimes. And a war monitor says that Israel has carried out more than 300 airstrikes across Syria in recent days. The UN is warning Israel that this needs to stop. Hello and welcome to the programme. We're going to take you straight to Syria. It's been dubbed the human slaughterhouse. I'm talking about the notorious Sednaya prison, once controlled by the ousted Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Well, as soon as it was liberated by Syrian opposition forces, many Syrians rushed to the vicinity in search of their loved ones who'd been detained by the Syrian government for years. Well, as former prisoners reunite with their families, questions remain about the prison's secret sections and the full extent of its brutal history under the Assad regime. Well, for more on this, we're joined now by Dr. Turkmani, who is director of the Syria Conflict Research Programme at the London School of Economics, whose cousin Abdullah was detained in Syria in 2016 at the age of 18. He has not been heard of since. Thank you for joining us once again, Dr. Turkmani. The truth is emerging, atrocities on a scale few people had imagined when we look at what happened, for example, at Sednaya. I mean, is what we're seeing worse than anything you'd imagined?
Absolutely. It's worse than the worst thing we imagined. We didn't realize the scale, what was going on inside the prison, the torture machines, the people who came out, like who spend decades and decades of their lives looking like ghosts. It's horrible beyond imagination. And what is most horrible is the people who don't come out. The list of people who disappeared in Syria, who were arrested and then disappeared, is more than 100,000. And sadly, only a small number of those people came out alive. So the worst thing yesterday was not what we've seen inside the prison. It's what we haven't seen. It's the people who didn't show up.
And of course, you and your family, as I said in the introduction, have experienced tragedy at the hands of Bashar al-Assad and his ruthless regime. Tell us your cousin's story. Tell us about Abdullah.
There are so many stories. Abdullah is one of them, and he was detained when he was only 18 years old in Homs. He was actually detained with his mother and uncle who were with him in the flat at that time. And the only reason they arrested the others is just to add pressure on him, to break him, so he, quote unquote, confess. And he disappeared into Sednaya, and we couldn't get any news about him since then. Every time we try, they say chances that actually he was killed there, and no one wanted to believe. His mother didn't want to believe. She already lost her husband during the conflict, and the rest of her family had to flee the country. She was living on her own in a flat in Homs, refusing to go anywhere since then, since 2016. And her excuse was she has to be at home so that if he's released and come back home, she has to open the door to him. He shouldn't find the house empty. Sadly, desperately, she was texting me the whole time, Reem, did you hear anything? Did they finish finding more people in Sednaya? And my heart just broke as I had to tell her that actually there are no more people. No one else is alive. And I had to tell her that. And it was just so heartbreaking having to do it. And I felt, well, she should know rather than continue to live under this unimaginable pain. She needs to start the grieving process, right? And yeah, so, and you can imagine how many other mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers who were going under this yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, a horrific ordeal for you and your family. I mean, what I found most shocking about the testimony you just gave there was how they used your cousin's mother, your aunt, as a weapon, a means to apply further pressure on an 18-year-old boy. As you're saying, absolutely shocking. I mean, has there now come a point where, you know, looking through the prison documents, that hope has been abandoned, or could he be being held in a different prison and not necessarily at Sednaya?
Every other prison we know of have been opened and people have been released. Detention center and mukhabarat branches all been open. There could always be some rooms. There were rumors or news about some smaller detention centers and the houses of some of the officers, but I mean, there will be only 10, 20 people there. I mean, the chances are almost non-existent. And so, as I said, it's so many stories. I mean, yesterday I was speaking to another cousin who was also detained, and it's a she this time, and she was only detained actually and locked in for more than 3 years to add pressure on another family member, you know, on her husband, and who was actually also detained, but on her father-in-law, who the regime accused to have been involved in the public movement against it. And she was 9 months pregnant when she was arrested. She gave birth inside the prison. Her baby, the first 40 days of her baby's life, were inside the prison. And then they took the baby forcibly from her, and they put the baby in an orphanage. The grandparents were begging to have that baby so they can look after her. And the regime would refuse, and they say, this is a musadarat, meaning confiscated material. So the baby was considered as an asset that was confiscated, and they put her in an orphanage to grow without her mother. You know, the happy ending is now the mother has been released in a prisoner exchange. She is united with her children, living with them safely. But you can imagine the horror she had to live through. And yesterday, when she was watching the images, she called me and she said, oh my God, I've seen the room where I was imprisoned yesterday in the media. It was in Al-Mazzi airport. She's seen it. She said, that's where I was all these years. That's where I, you know, my... So she's seen it. I mean, it's just, it's unimaginable. I mean, the pain and horror all these people went through.
I mean, and all the
and
while...
She's the lucky one who came out alive, you know. Imagine how many people lived and died inside these prisons.
Indeed. I mean, 500,000 people died, 100,000, as you say, disappeared. And all the while, the man who was at the helm of this regime, Bashar al-Assad, has got asylum, we understand, in Moscow. Do you have any hope that he will one day face justice for what he is responsible for?
I hope he will face justice. But now that he's in the hand of Russia, that will all be subject to some international deals and negotiations. But what I'm more concerned about right now is to prevent the rise of yet another dictator. The prospect in Syria is not good right now. We got rid of Assad, but the prospect of having yet another dictator is strong and is real. And it looks, by the look of it, we're changing just one ideology with another. But everything we're seeing is very concerning. The head of HTS, who now is claiming power over Syria, has prisons which are packed in Idlib, packed with people who just dare to oppose him. So am I optimistic? I'm not.
I mean, tell us a little bit about daily life in Syria, because you've still got family there, as we've been talking about your family quite a lot.
Yeah.
Some of them are in Damascus. I understand you've got siblings who are there. What's their day-to-day life, and what does it feel like to them waking up today for the third day without Bashar al-Assad in charge of their country? Does it feel safe to walk the streets? Have they got adequate provisions? What's their daily reality like?
Okay, so the daily reality really differs from one city to the other. In Homs, things are a little bit more under control. Not much, but a bit more. Some shops started opening, slow comeback of daily life, but still people are concerned. In Damascus, however, it's completely different. My sister, texted me from there, said, you're all rejoicing, but for us, Damascus turned into a big prison right now. They don't dare to get out of the house because there's firing everywhere, arms everywhere. The different armed groups who seized Damascus are now fighting over Damascus, and they're filling the city with just random shootings and clashes everywhere. It's difficult in Damascus right now, and there are big questions about what's going to come next.
I mean, in terms of which direction Syria takes, I think the international community would love to see something that looks like an inclusive government there that represents the different groups, the Kurds, the different sects of all the different religions that are there. As things currently stand, it doesn't sound like you think that's likely to happen anytime soon.
I don't see any inclusive government emerging from the current reality in Syria, but we need every pressure by the international community, by the neighboring Arab countries to ensure that we get an inclusive, legitimate governing body in Syria very soon. We already have the UN infrastructure and Resolution 2254 that has a roadmap for Syria. It's a bit out of date, but it's still what's in it really has the blueprint for a transition, orderly transition in Syria, an inclusive one. And we really need to unite about that. I don't think it's in the best interest of any Arab country to see an extreme organization in control of any other Arab country, not on its borders. It's in their interest to see something inclusive and stable. Right now, the prospect of an extreme organization being in control of the country is raising alarms all around Syria among not only the minorities who had fears, historic fears, but also among the rest of the Syrians. Nobody is thinking about them. They're all concerned. They're all worried. And if this doesn't change, we're really risking yet another bloody episode of civil war. And I'm sorry about this. I know everyone is rejoicing. We're all happy to have got rid of the regime, but we should be mindful of all the risks coming ahead.
And in fact, one of the arguments that was perpetually used by Bashar al-Assad and those who supported him was that he was the only person, or someone like him, was the only way of holding the country together and protecting all of these minorities. Do you think that perhaps there was some truth to that argument? And the other part of this question is, do you see Syria fragmenting into a series of smaller countries?
Sadly, Assad, let me repeat this. Assad supporters' motto was Al-Assad or Nahraq al-Balad, meaning either Assad or we'll burn the country. And I think Assad, before leaving Syria, created such an environment. He created the conditions for the country to be burned. He left it unprotected, no orderly transition, no arrangement, no delegation of power. So the country is up for grab from different powers inside the country, but also outside. We've seen what Israel is doing today. And by the look of it, it's going to be a mess. Now, I don't see a divided country as in international new borders being drawn in Syria. I think we're going to continue to see different conflict lines, including with the northeast. But I don't see a permanent division coming, and I could be wrong.
And of course, today sort of is a bit like the first day of a new school in a way for Syria, because state institutions have started to reopen, we're told today, banks, official centres of administration, possibly some schools as well. It doesn't sound to me like, from anything you've said up until now, that this feels like the beginning of a new and happy chapter for your country.
No, it's not. we could actually turn it into a happy chapter. So it depends on what we do right now. We all have a role to play, every one of us, the Syrians, the ordinary Syrians, the civil society, the political forces, but also the internationals. We should all ensure that an inclusive governing body is going to emerge out of this and follow 2254. No one should recognize and deal with the head of terrorist organization who spent more than 13 years in Al-Qaeda ranks and who is close to al-Zawahiri. I don't buy all this behavioral change they're talking about because it's very recent. It's 13 days old. We have 13 years of very coercive behavior that we've seen to worry about. So we all have a role to play, and we can make this a happier ending than the current one we're seeing right now.
I mean, half of Syria's population is displaced, many of them internally, but then, of course, millions of people are around the world, a very talented diaspora right across the globe. I mean, they're a great asset. Do you see signs, or do you have any anecdotes from your friends, your contacts, that people might start thinking about coming back and perhaps helping and being part of this rebuilding process?
Now, the refugees in the regional countries across the borders are trying to go back right now. But if we're talking about the Syrian diaspora, the expertise, the wealth of people that we have around the globe, I spoke to many of them today and they said, well, what's going on? We have to wait and see. How can we go in there right now? Many of them have spoken openly against HTS and they will be worried to go back. Many of them are willing to do everything to help the country, but they don't want to do it under the leadership of al-Jawlani. So that was very clear from everyone. Okay. This is why it's so risky to keep somebody like him in charge, because, or somebody on his behalf, like even if he appoints somebody from his side, because nobody wants to work under their leadership, or not everybody, only few people would like to work under such leadership.
Would you go back on and visit, for example, or just too early to tell?
It's too early to tell.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Dr. Reem Turkmani, thank you for being with Al Arabiya News.
Thank you so much.
Well, following on from the fall of the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, a number of European countries and the United Kingdom say they're suspending asylum procedures for Syrian nationals. Well, this comes as the UK faces a dilemma on the designation of the Syrian armed forces who toppled Assad. Well, the group in question, HTS, has been on the UK terror list ever since 2017 as an affiliate of Al-Qaeda. Well, speaking to the press during a visit to Saudi Arabia, the British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer said that the Syrian situation was still in its early days and that no decision has been made with regards to the removal of that group from the UK terror list.
The situation is obviously very volatile in Syria. It is very good that Assad is gone, but it doesn't necessarily mean that what follows is settled by any means at all. It is really important we talk to our regional allies, our global allies, about the way forward, which has to be a political way forward. And that does mean, to answer your question, a rejection of terrorism, a rejection of violence. So we have to be really clear about the terms. Very early days, but they're the discussions that we're having with our allies. No decision is pending at all on this. It is far too early. At the moment, the focus has to be on talking to our allies, making sure that this is an opportunity for Syria, and therefore we have to work to make sure that it's a peaceful opportunity.
The British Prime Minister speaking there. Well, for more, we can speak now to Sir Mark Lyall Grant, the former UK National Security Chief and Permanent Representative to the United Nations. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us, Sir Mark. We just heard there from the British Prime Minister saying it's far too early to think about removing Hayat Tahrir al-Sham from the UK terror list. Do you agree with him?
Well, I think removing them from the terror list is a sort of technical step that will need to be taken at some point, certainly. I think more important in the short term is that there is some degree of contact between the British government and the new authority in Damascus, and that means Mohammed al-Jawlani in particular. So there are ways that we can have a communication, I think, with him without actually lifting HTS from the terrorist list. But that is something that I'm sure the government will move to relatively quickly.
Yeah, we've heard from the UN envoy for Syria saying that the reality so far is that HTS and the other armed groups have been sending out what he called good messages to the Syrian people. I don't know what you think of that, but I mean, clearly words are one thing, actions are another matter, aren't they?
Yes, I mean, I think the words of Giuliani in particular has been pretty positive, talking about respect for other communities and not pushing any of the sort of ancient jihadist agenda that HTS had in the past. So, yes, I think that's encouraging. But as you say, deeds are more important than just words. And it's not going to be a smooth, easy path from what was a brutal dictatorship under the Assads to some sort of Western liberal democracy. Obviously, that's not going to happen in Syria. And there's going to be a lot of bumps and difficulties along the way, as we have seen in Libya when Gaddafi was overthrown and in Iraq when Saddam Hussein was overthrown. You know, those countries are still in a certain degree of turmoil many years later. So we shouldn't expect immediate, rapid, positive change in Syria.
I mean, you mentioned Libya, there's Iraq, Afghanistan as well, other examples that can be looked at. Do you think lessons have been learned? And do you think not one of the lessons that's been learned is don't interfere with a homegrown sense of discontent, because that's when the problems begin, is when there's interference. And this, it would appear, has been homegrown. This was a genuine opposition movement that was not, it would appear, aided by any external forces. What are your thoughts?
Well, that would be ideal, but I'm afraid that that ship has sailed as far as Syria is concerned, because in addition to all the different internal forces, whether that's the Kurds or the Alawites or the HTS or the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army, there's huge divisions within the country, not to mention Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, who are still present in the country. But of course, there are many external forces already there. You've got the Russians and the Iranians, for whom this is a huge strategic defeat. But nonetheless, the Russians will be desperate to hang on to their military bases on the Eastern Mediterranean. You've got the American troops who are in the south of the country, and you've got the Israelis who've carried out more than 300 strikes in the last couple of days, you know, essentially destroying all Syria's military capability. So there's a huge amount of external intervention already, and I don't think that is going to change in the next few weeks.
And lots of worry about possible chemical weapons stockpiles in Syria, and that's obviously something that the Israelis have been, well, they say they've been trying to target. I mean, how worried are you about the possibility of there being these depots full of chemical weapons there?
Well, I think there are probably some storage facilities in which there are chemical weapons. I don't know whether the Israelis are particularly targeting that. It seems to me that they're targeting, you know, a widespread Syrian military capability that could pose a potential future threat to Israel. But I don't know if they're particularly going after chemical sites. But clearly that would be very dangerous if they were. And all the countries in the region have a common interest in cleaning up the chemical weapons facilities that Syria had. So I don't expect there to be a huge international dispute on that particular aspect, compared to the sort of political dispensation where there will be undoubtedly disagreements.
Syria is a huge country, and as you are well aware, geographically it's enormous and it has borders with 5 countries. Some of those borders looking quite porous at the moment, and I'm just wondering if you think that represents a threat to security in Europe and indeed across the region, the Middle East.
Well, at the moment, what we're seeing is a sort of flow of refugees back across the border into Syria. But that could change very quickly. And if there is an outbreak of further violence and some sort of civil war develops inside Syria yet again, then of course there'll be a refugee outflow. We mustn't forget that Al-Qaeda and ISIS are still present there. They have their own agenda. And if they are driven out of Syria, of course, they will be moving into neighboring countries in the region. So that is a concern. There are also many European nationals being held in camps or prisons in the sort of Kurdish-held areas in the north of the country, and they too must be dealt with at some point. So I think there's a lot of issues that are going to have to be addressed in the coming weeks.
I just want to ask you about the decision by Russia to provide asylum to Bashar al-Assad and his family. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that was the least they could do. For Russia, Syria was the main foothold in the Middle East. It was their most important ally in the region. They've got these two military bases, a military base and a naval air base and a naval base on the Eastern Mediterranean, which have become even more important as their navy is unable to operate freely in the Black Sea. They militarily involved themselves in Syria in 2015 in support of Assad to keep him in power. Now he has gone, and they were pretty helpless in sort of preventing what has happened, the revolution that's happened over the last couple of days. And so I think the least they could do was offer asylum to Assad himself and his family. I'm not surprised by that at all. I don't think there was anywhere else he could have gone.
And I know you've been following this story closely because as I was doing my research, I was told that your wife, 12 years ago, wrote to Asma al-Assad, the wife of Bashar al-Assad, calling on her to do something about the situation in Syria. I'm just wondering, what could she have done realistically? And I should point out for our viewers that she's a British national.
She is a British national, and that was one of the reasons why my wife, Sheila, and the wife of the German ambassador in New York wrote this open letter to Asma al-Assad, asking her to restrain her husband at a time when he was beginning to repress what was still largely peaceful demonstrations against his regime. This was in 2011. Of course, that letter did not have any direct impact. But I think it's a sign that people in Britain in particular are horrified that someone who has British nationality, that who has gone through the British educational system, had a good job in the UK, then married Bashar al-Assad, sort of stood by while he became a despot and a tyrant and abused and tortured and killed many of his own nationals. I think it's a great sadness that she was not only witness to that, but obviously participated in it.
Can we blame her? I mean, some people have told us that Bashar al-Assad wasn't even in control himself and that he was just a sort of a puppet. And some have described him as being a prisoner in a cage of his father's making.
Well, I think there's probably some truth to that, but nonetheless, she stood by him. There was absolutely no sign that she distanced herself from her husband, as she could well have done, and therefore I think must take the blame for being associated with a particularly bloody, tyrannical regime. I don't think she can escape blame for that, even though her hands, in a sort of personal sense, may not be filled with blood.
The new leadership in Damascus is talking about pursuing former senior officials in Assad's regime for torture, war crimes, a whole host of crimes. Many of them are suspected of having fled Syria or gone to parts of Syria where they won't be found. I mean, can the international community, and do you think the international community will and should help track those people down?
I think there will be an effort to target certain of the worst offenders when it comes to torture and abuse of prisoners in Syria. Yes, and I think the International Criminal Court may look more widely now, even at Assad himself. Syria is not a member of the International Criminal Court, so the jurisdiction is obviously limited. But nonetheless, I think there will be some attempts to bring to justice those who have behaved in a particularly heinous way. But it's important not to have a sort of widespread witch hunt against everyone who supported Assad in the country, and that it is focused on those who are personally involved in the worst criminal offences.
And just lastly, Sir Mark, I mean, it's been an extraordinary 10 days, as we've been saying, and now that the curtain has been lifted to some extent on the scale of the atrocities, that the regime always denied. They always denied that they mistreated their people, but the reports came out nevertheless. But what stood out for you out of all the sort of revelations, all the reports, all the images that we've been able to see these last few days? What struck you the most?
Well, I think what struck me the most is the sort of widespread joy and relief of the ordinary Syrian people that the Assad dictatorship, which after all has lasted 50 years, you include Assad and his father, is finally over. And many people thought this day would never come. In terms of the sort of revelation of atrocities, I don't think I myself are at all surprised. We did an exhibition of papers and evidence, photos, etc. in the United Nations back in 2011, 2012. It was well known what was going on in these prisons in Damascus in particular. So I'm not surprised by some of the horrific revelations that are coming out. But I think what is striking for me is the joy of people, even in Latakia, even in the Alawite areas of Syria, there doesn't appear to be any love lost for the Assads as they depart the country.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Sir Mark Lyall Grant, thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
So, after more than half a century of Assad family rule, Bashar al-Assad is no longer in office and his army has been defeated, leaving behind, according to several reports, stockpiles of weapons. Well, these include chemical weapons that are understood to have killed thousands of people, thousands of civilians during the Syrian civil war. Well, this brings to mind the harrowing images from the Damascus suburb of Ghouta in 2013. So what happens now to these weapons and what is being done to ensure they don't fall into the wrong hands? Well, just last week, before Assad's downfall, the US intelligence services said they were monitoring chemical weapons sites in Syria, looking for any signs that the government might try using remaining stockpiles to prevent opposition forces from seizing the capital. Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to William Alberque, who is former director of NATO's Arms Control, Disarmament and Weapons of Mass Destruction Non-Proliferation Centre. Thank you so much for being with us once again here on Al Arabiya News. Let me just start by asking you, what sorts of weapons do you believe are hidden away in these depots across Syria?
Well, so in addition to conventional weapons of all types, missiles, rockets, artillery, anti-aircraft missiles, all these kinds of things, we also have intelligence that Syria has retained a fairly large stock of chemical weapons. And this includes sarin, VX, and chlorine that we either know that they have used since they were supposed to have destroyed all their stocks, or have detected traces through inspections by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. In fact, on December 5th, Izumi Nakamitsu, the UN Secretary General's Special Representative for Arms Control, testified before the UN that there were still 19 issues unresolved related to the destruction of Syria's chemical weapons arsenal.
Okay, and of course this all as well dates back to 2013 when Assad is accused of carrying out those sarin gas attacks on Ghouta. More than 1,400 people died, and there was a Russian-American deal that was brokered at the time, whereby, as you've been saying, Syria was supposed to dispense with all of its supplies of chemical weapons. So what you're saying is that they've restocked, and perhaps they weren't entirely forthcoming in their declaration of what they had in their arsenal 10 years ago.
Exactly. There was the US-Russian agreement to eliminate Syria's chemical weapons, and also Syria acceded to the Chemical Weapons Convention, which required Syria to declare exactly what they had, both in terms of manufacturing capability and stockpiles. And as soon as that agreement was signed, there were suspicions that they had not declared everything, because one of the shortcomings of the CWC, of the Chemical Weapons Convention, is you can't just go looking for undeclared sites. So Syria claimed that it destroyed everything that they declared. But again, if they didn't declare stuff, if they hid stuff away from that declaration, which is what we strongly suspect that they did, and we now have very firm evidence that they did, then it's very difficult to spot and destroy that under international agreements. So we believe that since 2013, they've maintained the stockpile, they've continued attacks. And again, as recent as last week, the UN declared that, and the OPCW confirmed that there are still huge unresolved issues, and the suspicion that there's very large stocks of sarin, VX, and chlorine chemical weapons.
So obviously there's major concern now. Syria's entered an uncertain new chapter. There's concern that these weapons could fall into the wrong hands, couldn't they?
Absolutely. Some of these chemical weapons are very easy to use. Chlorine, for instance, chlorine gas is very easy to deploy, and Syria has used it many times during the conflict. Al-Qaeda has used chemical weapons as well. So the fear is that these groups will use something more deadly like VX or sarin, which is unbelievably lethal and just horrific effects in terrorist attacks or in larger scale attacks against the new coalition that's in charge of Syria, or against other governments, against Turkey, against Iraq, against other countries in the region.
But shouldn't the organization that monitors chemical weapons, the OPCW, be on the ground and in the country, instead of the situation we're in right now, which is that Israel's carrying out airstrikes? And an extension of that question, is it dangerous to bomb a chemical weapons facility? I mean, doesn't that represent a risk in itself?
Well, ideally, yes, of course. Ideally, Syria would have declared everything that they had so that we knew exactly where the chemical weapons are and we could destroy them under international agreements. But they didn't. They hid the storage of a lot of the chemical weapons, and they didn't declare a number of facilities. So now we see airstrikes being carried out by Israel, possibly by the United States as well, to try to destroy these stockpiles. It is somewhat dangerous to destroy these chemical stocks through bombs. I mean, you would much rather do it through the chemical elimination processes that have been proven to be very, very safe. But when you have a choice between either leaving these facilities completely unguarded and chemical weapons open to be stolen by anyone, or destroying them through kinetic action, obviously Israel, for its own security, probably the US as well, is going to just try to destroy them. The good news, bad news, when you use a bomb to destroy the chemical weapons, it may aerosolize it, it may spread it, but hopefully any spread would be very, very localized. It would burn up in the heat of the explosion, and it would have relatively small effects on those around it. But there is a risk to people who are near those chemical storage facilities. Of course, Syria put them at risk by not declaring these sites to the OPCW, to the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and destroying the stocks under international law. They violated UN Security Council resolutions, and they've put the people who live around these facilities at tremendous risk.
And just lastly, with regards to chemical weapons, before we move on to other aspects of the military activity in Syria at the moment, I mean, chemical and also biological weapons, you're saying chlorine quite easy to use, but others are not quite so easy to use, are they? Because they've got to be used in exactly the right proportions, and the chemicals and the agents have to be stored in exactly the right conditions, and they've got a sell-by date, haven't they?
That's right. When you talk about the more complex chemical weapons, especially binary agents, these are agents that are stored two inert chemical compounds separately, that when you mix them turn into something incredibly deadly that can kill people. They have to be mixed together properly. Usually they have to be filled in very special delivery mechanisms, specifically designed bombs, etc. You can't just take these things and smash them together and throw them and hope they'll work. They'll end up killing the people who are trying to use them. And you're right, some of them have limited shelf life because the active agents in the chemical weapons themselves are limited in use. Sometimes even if you fill a artillery shell or rocket with these chemical weapons, they can have corrosive effects on the weapons. There's a limited amount of time that you can fill them into the delivery system before it starts to render itself inoperative or to set off before it's launched. So there's still a risk that we may not find all the stocks quickly, that they may have been dispersed right before the collapse of the Syrian government. And so some of these chemical weapons may be found years from now. We just don't know, which again makes Syria's violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention even more worrisome and could have troubling effects for the region for years to come.
Okay, just moving away from chemical weapons and talking more broadly about some of the military hardware that the regime of Bashar al-Assad has left behind. I mean, Syria's new leaders, it would appear, have got something of an air force, something of a navy at their disposal, and at the same time Israel is carrying out all these airstrikes across Syrian territory. Is that with a view to absolutely erasing what's left of the air force and the navy, and making sure that Syria needs to start at sort of ground zero militarily?
I certainly think that's what Israel's hope is to destroy as much of the military capability that any future government or terrorist organization might use against Syria. So we've seen the sinking of a number of naval vessels. On the one hand, I think Israel will want Syria to have a certain amount, or the new Syrian government, the HTS, certainly, to have a certain amount of weapons necessary to continue to hold Al-Qaeda or ISIL at bay. You don't want to leave a situation where the new government finds itself overrun by extremists. So I think Israel's trying to find a balance between the kinds of systems that threaten Israel directly, the longer range missiles and naval vessels, and certain types of aircraft, while at the same time leaving an amount of weapons that Syria will need to be able to defend itself against these other groups. We have to remember, Syria, just because Damascus has fallen, Syria is not unified, whole, and at peace. It's still riven with conflicts. There's many, many armed groups, and management of that, rather than descent into total chaos, is in Israel's interest.
And there's another country we haven't talked about when it comes to defence and military hardware on the ground in Syria, and that is, of course, Russia, which has its Mediterranean base at Tartus. It's got an air base in Latakia province. I'm just wondering, I mean, Israel's got to be very careful, hasn't it, striking military hardware all around Syria, because some of it does belong to Russia. And I'm also just wondering whether you think Syria's new leaders are likely to allow Russia to maintain a presence on their soil.
Well, that's a really fascinating question, and something that is a real unknown right now. We've seen a shift in how Moscow is talking about the new government. They've shifted from talking about armed insurgents to armed groups. So I think Russia's trying to moderate its diplomacy and probably to reach out to the new government to allow it to continue. For Russia, that air base and that naval base are of such critical importance to Russia's capability to project power in the Mediterranean and beyond. For instance, the naval base that you mentioned at Tartus, if that naval repair facility goes away, Russia would have less of a rate to transit vessels from the Black Sea through the Straits through Turkish territory because of the Montreux Convention. The Montreux Convention only allows Russia access to the Mediterranean because of the Tartus repair facility. That's a little loophole in the Montreux Convention. So without that, Russia would be limited in the types and numbers of vessels that it can pass through from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean Sea. And this airbase Russia has used for tremendous numbers of operations across Northern Africa, in Libya, and other countries like that. So if the new government restricts Russia's use of Syrian territory, it would be really, really fascinating. It would really hamper Russia's future efforts. And as you mentioned, in terms of Israel destroying Russian equipment, I think Israel is going to be incredibly unsympathetic to Russia. Russia has supported Syria through thick and thin. Syria has become, before this recent upheaval, a transit point for Iran to move missiles and weapons to Hezbollah and Hamas. So I think Israel may be a little bit gleeful in terms of striking back at Russia and punishing Russia for its support and using Syria as a platform to harm Israeli interests. It'll be really interesting to see how the Israel-Russia relationship falls out now that Russia has lost a lot of its leverage in Syria.
And just lastly, I mean, it's been an extraordinary 10 days. I mean, very unpredictable and very unexpected series of outcomes. I just want to get your perspective now that you've had a couple of days to reflect on it. But how do you think Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the other opposition forces managed to gain so much ground in so little time? What are your thoughts?
I think it's really an extraordinary confluence of factors, both because of Russia's complete distraction by its war on Ukraine and really hollowing out its forces in Syria and moving a lot of its heavy equipment and cutting off Syria from the Assad government from access to ammunition and resupply and airstrikes and all the things that Assad had relied upon to contain HTS. So I think they saw an extraordinary opportunity. Iran as well, completely distracted by the twin wars in Lebanon and in Gaza, and so not able to support Syrian forces as well. But I think even HTS could not have predicted the unbelievable successes that they've had, the complete collapse of the Syrian military, echoes of other cases where governments have just not been able to defend themselves. It just appears the Syrian military itself was just not willing to continue this fight. So a confluence of factors, plus Turkey getting much more involved in the conflict and seeing opportunity. It's truly an extraordinary moment where the Syrian government, once confronted with the absolute distraction of Russia and Iran and other conflicts, was simply unable to defend itself, and HTS was able to seize that moment with just an amazing campaign to seize Damascus. But we still have to recognize that although Assad has collapsed, as I mentioned before, the rest of the country still is in turmoil. There's many armed groups. So they've managed to knock Damascus out in an incredible, incredible moment. But it just goes to show, when you rely on a country like Russia or Iran, who have so many other irons in the fire in terms of the chaos they're trying to sow in other regions, just not reliable partners, just not there for you when you really need them. And so a lot of the criticism that countries have pointed at Russia for their involvement in Ukraine, for their meddling all across the world, I think a lot of countries who have aligned with Russia are going to be second-guessing themselves, and Iran as well. Iran showing that when Assad was really up against it, Iran just melted away and was not willing to do everything they could to support the forces of Assad to defend Damascus.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. Really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. William Alberque, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Tom.
Meanwhile, Israel is denying reports that its forces have penetrated into Syrian territory beyond the buffer zone near the Golan Heights. Well, ever since the weekend, the Israeli military has carried out a wave of heavy airstrikes right across Syria. Well, those strikes came on the heels of the collapse of Bashar al-Assad's government. Well, Israel is understood to have seized a roughly 400 square kilometre buffer zone near the Golan Heights inside Syrian territory. Well, in response to the Israeli heavy airstrikes, the UN Special Envoy to Syria has called on Israel to halt its military movements and bombardments inside Syria.
And then a very troubling development. We are continuing to see Israeli movements and bombardments into Syrian territory. This needs to stop.
Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Yaakov Amidror, who's a retired Israeli Major General, former National Security Advisor to the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, today at Ginza in Washington. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. We've received reports about there being tanks close to the outskirts of Damascus. I mean, is that true? And if so, what would Israeli tanks be doing so close to the Syrian capital?
It's not so close to the Syrian capital, but remember, the Syrian capital is 36 kilometers from the borders of Israel. It's not 100 kilometers away. I mean, it's very close anyhow. So what Israel is doing, we understand that the group of rebels that came from Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and so on organizations are now taking the control of Syria. And we want to be sure that whatever their policy in the future will be, they will not be in a position to attack Israel. We learned from the history that those groups at the beginning, they speak very nicely, but at the end of the day, in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, they are becoming what they are, Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And we as Israel cannot allow it to have very close to our communities in the Golan Heights, or having the military capabilities that Assad had. And this is why we are very active now.
What's your understanding? I mean, out of these 300 Israeli strikes or more now that have been carried out since Bashar al-Assad was toppled, what are the targets principally? What's Israel trying to achieve here?
The targets are either chemical weapon systems, missiles, and other military capabilities in air, sea, and land that we don't want. that those organizations, as I said, these are organizations which came from ISIS and Al-Qaeda together, will have these capabilities in their hands. It's too dangerous to the state of Israel. It's too dangerous to the Middle East. At the end, we have to take into consideration the fact of their views about Israel and their views about the relations between Islamic very extreme organizations and the other parts of the world, including Jews, Christians, and so on. So what we are doing is that just taking out of their hands all these capabilities that might be used in the future in irresponsible way by the by the new regime in Syria.
I mean, obviously, no country wants to see Syria's new leadership or anyone else in Syria using chemical weapons. But is this really just Israel's fight? Because there are bodies, aren't there, like the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and that is precisely their job, isn't it?
Yes, and they were very good in the past to do whatever is needed, and they do whatever is needed that Assad will not use it, and others in the Middle East. With all due respect to all those organizations, they didn't make any one step to have a situation in which they don't have military chemical capabilities. So I don't have an answer just to smile to your question. Knowing the history of those organizations, they are never did what they're supposed to do.
Syria, of course, borders a number of countries, not just Israel at the Golan Heights, but other countries as well. How real do you think the risk is of spillover from any reignited conflict on Syrian soil into countries that border Syria?
It very much depends on the decision of the new rulers of Syria. They have an old issue with Hezbollah in Lebanon, and they might use their capabilities to deal with Hezbollah in Lebanon. It will not be so bad. They might think of exporting their ideas into Jordan and Iraq, and that will be very bad. So very much depends on their decision how to use the new situation when they are now controlling the state, unlike in the past. Remember that when Khamenei came from Paris to Tehran, he was very, very modest guy. He said that it will be another area and so on and so forth. And at the end of the day, you know what happened in Tehran. This is the way of very extreme movement coming into being governments in countries. At the beginning, they are very modest, but at the end, we see their real face. Here, what they said up till now, at least, is not about exporting their extremist idea, but I don't know what will happen in the future. And if I would be the rulers of Jordan and Iraq, I will be very, very cautious in the future.
We heard from the Israeli Prime Minister shortly after the downfall of Bashar al-Assad, and he seemed to be taking some credit for Assad's downfall. I mean, do you think that's credit he deserves to be taking?
No question that I think that there is no even one expert of the Middle East that don't see the connection between the success of Israel of weakening Hezbollah and Iran and the ability of the rebels to go into Syria and not facing both Iran and Hezbollah fighting them in Syria. That happened in the past, but today it's different Iran after the attack of Israel. It's different Hezbollah. Hezbollah is much weaker than in the past and is not in a situation to help, was not in the situation to help Assad. So no question there is a strong connection between the success of Israel of bombing and killing the whole leadership of Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the fact that Iran is much weaker than in the past because of what we attack there, and because they don't have the proxies. They lost Hamas, and they lost a lot of what capacities of Hezbollah, And when these two organizations are very weak, Iran is standing vis-a-vis Israel directly, not through proxies. And the last time that Israel bombed in Iran lost its a lot of its defense capabilities. So I think that the fact that Israel succeeded to deal with Hezbollah and with Iran is very much connected to the success of the rebels, no question.
Okay, and in terms of these accusations leveled at Israel by some countries in the region and by the United Nations, I should add, that somehow Israel is trying to exploit the disarray in Syria for its own gain. How do you respond to that?
I think that Israel will be irresponsible if Israel will not prepare itself to a new situation in which the sons and the sons of Al Qaeda and ISIS are going close to our border, and Israel will not do something to be better prepared for such a situation. You know, as we know, what they have in mind, what is their policy, what is their ideology, and we should be prepared. And what we are doing now is to be better prepared to a decision that might be taken by those rebels, which represent very extreme ideas. I mean, I'm very glad for the Sunnis in Syria that they succeeded to topple the murderer from Damascus, Assad the son. But from our point of view, these people which came from Idlib are very bad people. They are representing very extreme views about the Middle East, about the Islamic, the Islam in the Middle East, and they are very, very against Israel. They had been in the past. I hope that they will not be in the future, but no can guarantee it. What they said about Israel in the past is very clear. Israel should be destroyed, and they want to reach the mosques in Jerusalem after they reach the mosques in Damascus. I'm quoting. So we have to be better prepared to this new situation. That's what we are doing. We will be better prepared after we succeed to neutralize a lot of the military capabilities that they might own in the future as the new rulers of Damascus. Okay. If it is chemical weapon systems or Navy capabilities. From our point of view, they will not have the ability to attack Israel, and will do whatever is needed to make sure that they will not be able to attack Israel.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you so much for speaking to us, retired Israeli Major General Yaakov Amidror. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
That is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.